right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Saturday, day 2 or 3, depending on how you count, of MELED. So, big applause for all of you. Thank you for being here on Saturday morning. I am really excited and honored to introduce you to the esteemed professor and researcher, Dr. Deborah Palmer, from the University of Colorado Boulder, where she works as a full professor in the program of Equity, Bilingualism, and Biliteracy, as well as Ethnic Studies and Culture, Language, and Social Practice. Previously, she was a professor at UT Austin and in California, where she got her PhD at Stanford, and was a classroom teacher for traditional dual language schools and also an EL teacher. She's won numerous awards for her teaching and scholarship and has published over 50 journal articles, I know because I counted all of them, as well as, if you count the book chapters, book reviews, magazine articles, presentations, there's hundreds. So very, very impressive. I first met Dr. Palmer when I was a grad student 10 years ago at the University of Minnesota. If any of you have done graduate work, I know a lot of you have because I've seen you, you know how debilitating that imposter syndrome can be. I had a lot of that. Middle-aged woman starting her PhD at age 40-something. And in that class, we had a lot of guest speakers. Dr. Palmer had just published her article that many of you have read. If you hadn't, you should read it, in TESOL Quarterly, which is one of the top publications. Middle-class English speakers in a two-way immersion bilingual classroom. Everyone should be listening to Jonathan right now. So that article was really influential for me and many people, so she was kind of a rock star. And for us, when she came, it was really refreshing. She was humble, brilliant, passionate, knowledgeable, so encouraging for all of us. Her deep knowledge of instruction for multilingual learners, which you will see in a minute, her passion for research, and her revolutionary spirit has inspired us then and will continue to inspire us and so many people all over the country, all over the world. You guys are in for a treat. Dr. Palmer has worked extensively in Minnesota as well. Some of you might have met her on the webinars that we did last year or 2 years ago now on critical consciousness. She's worked with some of your districts and has really been passionate about learning about how things work here in Minnesota. She's a leader in critical consciousness, especially in dual language bilingual education, teacher leadership for social change, and currently she's interested in student participatory action research, which is what she will talk about today. So please give a huge round of applause and a warm welcome to Dr. Deb Palmer.
So, I think my mic right here is working now, correct? Great. I asked them to, they're awesome over there in the tech section. I asked them to give me this opportunity so that I didn't have to be behind a podium the whole time. Because I want to be able to talk to you even though the lights make it so I can't quite see you, but then I don't have my glasses on so I wouldn't really see you anyway, so it's all good. I'm Deb Palmer, or Deborah Palmer, either one. I answer to both. In Spanish, I'm usually Deborah, right? In English, I'm Deb. And thank you, Amy, for that wonderful introduction. I do feel a special place in my heart for Minnesota because I've been coming here since the beginning of my career. The very first academic conference I came to was here in Minnesota at the Carla Institute one summer when my first child was a very small baby. So, and I presented the research that Amy talked about that came out in the TESOL Quarterly article. That was my dissertation work, looking at language and power dynamics in two-way dual language programs. Before I go any further, I want to do a quick land acknowledgement. Where I live in Boulder, where I took this photo, not far from my home, was land forcibly removed from the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples, among others. I know that here in St. Paul, the first peoples were known as the Hopewell tribe, and we still have many different tribes who've lived in this space before and since. And so I do this every time I give a keynote. I look up organizations working for Native peoples in the local community. So here are 3 organizations that are here present in St. Paul. And I gave a small donation to this last one, the American Indian Family Center, in honor of our conference today in our gathering, because land acknowledgements don't do a whole lot unless we put a little bit of action behind them. And all three of these organizations do a lot of action for Native families in this community, so I wanted you to know about them. In fact, they are live linked on the slide, so once I pull up a QR code in a minute, if you want the slides, you can have a copy and you can link and learn more. Here's my plan for today. I'm going to tell a story and connect it to a framework that I've been working with for a while about critical consciousness in dual language bilingual ed. But I think the framework, it can expand, and that's what we're going to do today. It's not just about dual language, but about language education in multilingual contexts. So that's all kinds of programs, ESL, ELD, bilingual ed, dual language. I think wherever multi-learners are present. And my conversation today is going to be about critical consciousness with youth who are seeking biliteracy pathways through K-12. So first, introductions. And here are the slides if you want to follow any of the links I have. And I promise they'll come back later. Let me just look and see. Yep, OK. So I'll put that slide up in a minute. I'm going to leave this here for you if you want it. Who I am. Well, Amy kind of did this already. You know a bit about who I am. I came into bilingual education because I was a teacher in California. I actually got my undergraduate degree at Stanford, and then I became a teacher there. And I got my doctorate at Berkeley, which is problematic because Berkeley, Stanford, they're rivals, so don't tell anyone. But I was a teacher in Redwood City, and we had a large population of Spanish-speaking migrant families there. And I was a beginner in Spanish at the time. So every classroom around me was a bilingual classroom, and mine was the ESL classroom for the non-Spanish, non-English, and for the folks who've been exited out of the bilingual program. I taught second and third grade and had a lot of immigrant children in my classroom. And I didn't have a skill set, and I didn't have language capacity to work effectively with them and their families. So I spent my summers doing that. I learned Spanish. I traveled throughout Latin America. I spent some time volunteering with the Zapatistas, who are a Maya community in the south of Mexico, who at the time were in a low-intense warfare with their own government, meaning not violent, but definitely intimidation happening. And I spent time learning about the ways that indigenous peoples and marginalized peoples around the world have struggled to gain access to education. And so that inspired me. I then went to Adelante was the school I taught in Redwood City, the Spanish immersion dual language bilingual program that I eventually worked in. Then I got my doctorate in bilingual education, language policy, and ended up as a professor preparing bilingual teachers in Austin, at UT Austin. And that's my family there. My two kids are now taller than me, but they are bilingual by choice in different ways. So I come from a gringo background, a little bit of Yiddish in my background, actually. No Spanish, but I've learned and I've engaged as best I can with the communities that I serve. So I don't stand up here alone, even though it looks like it, although I have this fantastic interpreter right here. Other than the interpreter, I actually stand up here with my colleagues who have worked on these ideas with me. The framework for critical consciousness in language education has been developed and co-developed primarily with these three scholars, but also with a number of other people, including Amy, who mentioned our videos and the projects that we did in the Midwest. So there might even be more people in this audience who participated in our webinars or who took part in our collaborations, and all of those count as helping us elaborate the concepts I'm going to share with you today. And they're an ongoing process of elaboration. Just like all research and practice in education, it's a cycle. We keep acting and reflecting and acting and reflecting. This is the book, though, that these three folks and I have put together that we're hoping might be useful for you. It has case studies. This one is focused on dual language bilingual contexts, but across the K-12 and higher ed spectrum, including teacher education, case study examples of critical consciousness. Maybe it'll be useful for some of you. The first chapter is open access and talks about what I'm going to be talking about today. So you can look it up and grab that if this is of interest. The other collaborating team I'm going to share material from today is the group that I've just begun collaborating with at my institution at CU Boulder. My colleague, Michelle Valladares, who is the Associate Director of the National Education Policy Center and who works with the Research Hub for Youth Organizing. And my doctoral student, Laura Meinzen. They're my co-conspirators on the project that I'm going to use as an example. And then these two folks, Reveline and Kate, have informed that project because they themselves have done youth participatory action research for language justice in New Mexico. And so their project has informed ours. So I want to get to know you, and I'm going to put my hand up here so that I can see. First of all, if you are a teacher in a K-12 classroom, pre-K-12 classroom, raise your hand. Ooh, that's most of you. Okay, great. If you are a parent, family, guardian of a multilingual child, raise your hand. And that can include also double identities. We all have them. Thank you. If you are a school or district leader or a coach in a language context or beyond. Great. And higher ed folks? All right. We've got a variety. Now, out of curiosity, how many of you are in dual language or bilingual contexts? Awesome. And ELD, ESL contexts? Great. Thank you. All right, so let's see if this works. Right. I'm curious now. Raise your hands if you're from this northern part of Minnesota up here. Anyone come in from way up north? A few? Okay. A few? Yeah. How about our central area and the Minneapolis-St. Paul area and all of the, that's where you're mostly from. Okay. And how about down south? Yeah, okay. And you're all sitting over there. That's the southern zone. Okay. And now I'd like to ask you to take just a minute. When I want you back, I'm going to go like this and wave at you and have you come back. Take a minute to find somebody sitting near you you don't already know. Turn and talk to them about why you're here today. Well, introduce yourself first. I'm just going to give you a minute. I'm sorry. Thank you. All right. Hardest part of doing turn and talks is calling the group back together. What was the one somebody taught me at the table this morning? Make a waterfall? Say waterfall. I like that one. All right. So I didn't actually get to hear too much of what you were saying out there because I can barely see you. That's okay. But I am guessing that overall, we all share a motivation to be here for our kids because our kids deserve the best. Our students, our multilingual learners. That's why we're here on a Saturday morning, right before Thanksgiving. So I will just venture to say that our common purpose is to advocate and do the best we can for those kids, right? But we know, and a lot of my work through the years has been looking at ways that our schools don't always do that. Our schools have many ways of marginalizing our multilingual learners. Unfortunately, we know, we experience every day some of the ways that the structures of schooling aren't set up for our kids who are coming from minoritized backgrounds, immigrant or refugee backgrounds. These are made up quotes, but they're things I've heard and seen over the years, and I think that you might be familiar with a lot of them. It's what we struggle against every day. We also, in particular, have some particular efforts going on right now to scapegoat immigrants. We have anti-immigrant discourse circulating, so that even though we all know that immigrants pay their fair share, work hard, have persevered through adversity, they are our neighbors, and in fact, most of us come from immigrant backgrounds. Misinformation and discrimination place blame on immigrants for so much that's going on in our world. We also have these discourses of English dominance that are really prevalent in the US and beyond, that English is the power language, even though we know that bilingualism is an asset. The world is multilingual. The US itself has never been monolingual. And we know that schools can and do build strong programs for multilingual and biliteracy development. But myths and misconceptions still frame bilingualism as the problem, or a problem, particularly for kids who use a non-English language at home, right? Bilingualism for some kids is more valued than bilingualism for others. So given all that, we're here to stand with immigrant and multilingual children and youth in challenging times. So what I want you to do to carry with you through the rest of my talk is think of a project, perhaps a unit of study, lesson series, sequence, a field trip, a community organization that you've been involved with or know about that does this, that stands by. And this is so that you can connect the ideas I'm saying with your own contexts, which are inevitably different from mine. So think for a minute of a project you know, or that does this, and carry that with you through the rest of this talk. I'm going to share, the project I want to share is Caminos hacia el Bilingüismo, a youth participatory action research project in Boulder, Colorado, that I've been working on for the past year. I have first some definitions for you. I want to share my conceptions of these ideas before we move on to the story. First, what is critical consciousness? I'm going to read Paulo Freire's quote here, learning to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions and take action against oppressive elements of reality. So Freire was a literacy educator from Brazil, whose book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, has been translated into umpteen languages and has made its circuit around the world. Sometimes it's the most banned book, I understand, in the world, sometimes very surreptitiously. He describes this need to develop a praxis cycle with the people whom we teach, to engage in their realities and understand their worlds. And he's speaking directly to people, to the oppressed in the world. But this is two pieces, right? First, it's learning to perceive. So regardless of your own positionality and where you come from, learning to notice and recognize inequities and injustices in the world. And then it's taking an ownership of them and doing something to counter them, to push back. That's critical consciousness in a nutshell. And this painting here, done by my friend Marta Samaniego Calderon in El Paso, Texas, is a conveyance of the idea. It's messy, it's beautiful, it's complex, it involves all kinds of literacy engagements, and it's never straightforward, right? Critical consciousness, you move forward and back, and you're always moving towards in your work, towards critical consciousness. To exist humanly is to name the world, to change it. Human beings are not built for silence, built in silence, but in word, in work, in action, and reflection. So critical consciousness, but what does that look like in a school or a classroom? So this is the framework that my colleagues and I have been putting together and thinking into. We've proposed that there are 4 actions that one in schools, any stakeholder in a school can take on an ongoing basis to move the community towards critical consciousness. Those are interrogating power, critical listening, historicizing, and engaging with discomfort. And then as one does that, some things emerge. Acompañamiento, which is solidarity in community, affirming identities, and translanguaging, which I know Susanna talked more deeply about yesterday and how that looks. So I'm going to talk about each of these in turn and how they showed up in our YPAR project. So think for a minute and actually I think I can give you this time. Yeah, I can give you a couple of minutes to turn and talk about how your project reflects these actions, your conception of them right now. So take 2 minutes, and remember, look up this way when we're going like this, me and the interpreter here, then come back. Ready, set, go. That's a big ask. I don't know yet if I'm going to do the next turn and talk. Depends on timing. Okay. That was not nearly enough time for such a big ask. I fully know that. But I want to tell you my story, so I'm going to get you back here. I first have to tell you what is YPAR. I am curious, in the audience, folks who are familiar with or even engaged in YPAR already? Not very many. Okay. Then YPAR, Youth Participatory Action Research, is when youth, often middle, high school youth, but youth of any age, co-design research projects. They themselves engage in every aspect of the research, community-based projects based on the questions of the community and drawing on the knowledges of the community, honoring that communities have knowledge that we can learn from. Youth themselves frame the questions, collect the data, analyze data, and disseminate their results into their communities. It's social justice oriented, action oriented, because young people are not just researchers, but change makers. And it's grounded in critical pedagogy, so Paulo Freire's work, inside and outside of schools, can happen anywhere. And remembering that culturally responsive teaching is never completely beyond context, nor is it ever totally replicable. Youth participatory action research and critical consciousness work are very situational and very contextually dependent. That said, in multilingual YPAR, meaning when you're doing youth participatory action work with multilingual youth, inevitably it becomes about language justice, and I've noticed this already in my own work. Even if the question is something different, language justice comes to the center of it because of who our students are as multilingual people. So a little bit of context for secondary education for multilingual learners. The options generally for multilingual learners at secondary schools are English-based, primarily, right? I think that's true in Minnesota as it is in Colorado. That there is ELD support for students who are identified as needing support to learn English. There is sometimes Spanish or maybe another world language, but taught as a world language, not necessarily as a heritage language or as a language that students would come in with some experience with in their family context. That I think New Mexico, where Susana Ibarra-Johnson comes from, that's an exception. They have a great deal of heritage Spanish instruction. There isn't enough here. There isn't enough in Colorado. That's one thing we need to grow in. Also, bilingual programs are pretty rare in secondary schools, middle schools and high schools. There's also at the same time the sort of metaphorical and actual gentrification of bilingual ed. It's a term we've been using for the past, I guess, about 8 years to talk about the ways that bilingual ed has been directed towards our English dominant speakers, as in language immersion programs, instead of towards our bilingual and multilingual speakers who come in with language resources in non-English languages, in place of and seen as a competition between. And that kind of gentrification of programs or actual gentrification of neighborhoods and schools is ongoing at secondary levels as well as elementary levels. I've done some work in elementary schools looking at that question, but this was our attempt to look at the secondary level. And it's interesting because youth voices are often absent from policy conversations. In secondary education, the kids are old enough. Often refugee kids are even older than your average high schooler, but they aren't part of the advisory councils as often as they should be. They aren't part of, their voices aren't around the table deciding what's going on. So that's why YPAR can help us do a better job. It's an active way to engage youth voices in policy making. And there's also the Seal of Biliteracy, which is a policy lever that is now available in every state in the nation and the District of Columbia. Minnesota was an early adopter. You all have had the seal and are doing a powerful job with it here in this state for at least 10 years now, a good decade. And that there's documented research that the Seal of Biliteracy actually increases world language course taking in high schools and beyond. And it supports improved student motivation for becoming bilingual and biliterate. That's evidence. That said, there's a huge range across the country in terms of the kinds of seals, what are the expectations for seals, accommodation or inclusion of languages that are less commonly taught in our schools, and recognition for the seal in higher education. I think Minnesota's ahead of the curve on this, much thanks to your State Department of Ed. But many places in the country are still working on this, very actively working on it. And there's no active data collection, as far as we know, regarding who is earning the seal and how prevalent it is nationwide in different spaces. There's pockets, right? So there's work to be done in terms of the seal, but it's there, and it's an opportunity to support biliteracy and the development of biliteracy programs. It allows us space. It's like a policy space for implementation. So now the story that led me into this work. So my friend Michelle, her son Jacob is a couple of years older than my son Jacob, and graduated from high school last year, year ago, right? And he's bilingual. His other mom is Guatemalan. He grew up in dual language programs through 8th grade. Our district in Boulder doesn't have high school bilingual programs, so kids get done with their 8th grade year and they kind of go to high school, and that's kind of it. Like, they don't have any more language programming. If they want the seal, like in Jacob's case, they have to sign up for the test and drive across town and sometimes pay, although the district waives the fee for some folks. And it's kind of complicated, a little paperwork to fill out, a lot to do. It was much easier for my daughter, who did AP Spanish and checked the box, right? And that was done. But Jacob didn't do AP Spanish because he's a heritage speaker of Spanish, and he basically, wasn't served by an AP course in high school. So his mom, Michelle, who navigated this journey with him, asked me, is this a common issue? Like, is this really usually harder for our heritage speakers than it is for our English dominant speakers to get a seal? And she was basically interrogating power in that moment, not just doing, but actually asking, is this normal? Is this equitable? Is this fair? And she was pushing back a bit in the name of equity and justice, not just for her own kid, but for the system, right? And interrogating power is questioning who holds power and calling out injustices in order to transform the systems behind them. And I told her, well, yeah, in fact, the Seal of Biliteracy has been challenged in research. We have identified challenges and issues with it. Right here in Minnesota, Schwedhelm and King are both scholars at the University of Minnesota. I don't know if Schwedhelm has graduated. I haven't kept track, but Dr. King is here. They also framed and have talked about the Seal of Biliteracy as an instance of neoliberal language education policy. Some of the known issues in research are that there's unequal access to and unequal distribution of benefits from the seal based on race and class and culture. There's also tests cost money, as was the case in Boulder, especially for less commonly taught languages, which is an inequity. And then finally, there's this sense that biliteracy is being framed as a commodity that is property, right? That is owned by whoever gets the seal. And the state gives people that property. You're biliteracy, you're biliterate. And so it's framed also as a way to earn more money. And that is necessarily in line with the way that heritage communities understand their languages and cultures. So in all these ways, there are some inequities in the seal of biliteracy policy, as in anything. And people are working on it, right? Students who speak English natively are granted a path for earning the seal through their world language curriculum that requires clearing fewer bureaucratic hurdles and that expects a lower level of second language development than the path offered to students, especially non-native English speakers, who might wish to use their proficiency in a home or heritage language to demonstrate their biliteracy. That was the experience that Jacob and his mom had, versus me and my daughter. So this is a turn and talk opportunity that I'm going to skip because of time. But I promise you, I have a workshop this afternoon, and if you want to talk more about the projects you've been engaged in and how they interrogate power, and to think into how YPAR might work in your context, you should come to my workshop. I'll plug it again later. I am curious to learn, so I hope you do choose to come. How did your project begin, and did it begin with an interrogation of power like mine did? Or does interrogation of power become a part of your project? How does it play in? How does your project interrogate power, and what does that lead to? Michelle, in turn, said, well, let's ask the students to help us. Michelle, being a researcher who does youth participatory action research, her obvious answer was, well, then let's ask the kids. Let's ask the students. And what came out of it is Caminos de Bilingüismo, a youth participatory action research project in Boulder, Colorado, which has been 2 years in the working now. We're in our second year. We enlisted students to design and carry out a research project to work towards high school bilingual education pathways in our district with an emphasis on linguistic justice. In the first year, the students carried out the research project and have been presenting it for different audiences. And in this second year, they're still going strong, a subset of them who were able to continue writing about it. So they're writing a policy memo, and then they'll be writing a research article in the spring. It began with me and with Michelle. My work has always been in considering ways that critical consciousness and teacher and student agency and language policy integrate into language education. It's also a known fact in our field that we need to do a better job with our adolescent multilingual learners and support more programming at secondary level to support success through our challenging spaces in high school, which are somewhat complicated, right? And I'm also a former parent in the district. I mentioned that my daughter was eligible for the seal. And Michelle, a parent of 2 kids at the high school we partnered with, her research is in youth organizing for education policy. So the partnership, I reached out to the district because I knew the CLD education director, that's ESL or ELD education, and she was enthusiastic about it. This is a district that has bilingual programming in elementary and middle school and aspires to do a high school program. So her feeling was that the youth voices would contribute to their efforts. Also, the high school itself was very open to the idea. It's a unique high school, small, 300 kids, and it has a quarter system. So kids change classes every 9 weeks, which was a plus and a minus for us because as a community engagement activity, which they had every Wednesday afternoon, we saw kids come and go every 9 weeks. So that was complicated, but it did allow spaces for more kids to come in. So that was a plus side for it. They also have a week-long fall service week. They're very engaged in the community, and the principal and the assistant principal were very enthusiastic about having the kids help them think about better ways to serve their small but growing population of bilingual students. Next, we needed a team to lead the workshop. I had an incoming doctoral student named Laura Meinzen, who's done similar work when she was a language arts high school teacher on the western slope of Colorado. She'd even written about it in El Soleado, which is Dual Language Education New Mexico's newsletter. And she wanted to come to doctoral studies so that she could understand how bilingual programs at high schools could empower young people, youth. So her alignment with the project was amazing. And she and I together hired Maya Milan, who was a CU undergraduate student. Actually, she's an engineering student. But she grew up in our district schools and achieved the seal, much like Jacob, without a whole lot of support from her high school, which has a pretty large population of Latino kids. She was super enthusiastic about the program, and she herself is from a Chicana background from New Mexico, where she was like I think she's fourth generation Latina. So that's our team, our workshop leaders. Next was recruiting the kids. And all students were eligible from the high school as long as they had some background in Spanish, because we were going to run the workshop bilingually. And that meant they came from heritage, dual language, or world language backgrounds. And there was quite a mix. They had to come in with curiosity and a willingness to engage in biliterate spaces. Yeah. And then for what did they get out of it? They got high school community engagement credit, which was required for them. They also got college credit. We arranged for them to get a course in the School of Education in youth research. And they got a small stipend. Their principal found a little pocket of money to thank them for their work, right? Because it was authentic work. It was real work that they did in this class to support the policy agendas of improving services for their families and communities and themselves. As you can see, we had 27 students in total, but only 2 of them stayed all year because of that quarter system situation. We had ins and outs. I'd say most of them stayed at least half the year, 3/4 for a lot of them. And there's only 3 in our year 2 project right now, but we're about to change quarters, so we'll see. We built community first. We learned about each other, and boy, it was a diverse group of kids, right? Coming from all kinds of biliteracy backgrounds, all kinds of race, cultural backgrounds too, and multi-generational in that there were the high school students, there was Maya, there was Laura, there was me, and Michelle, multi-generational co-constructing knowledge. We also spent time building community and setting a purpose so that we could co-design research questions. The kids did an activity that I'm going to try out in the workshop today. They did a question storm to help them. They also first, before the question storm, talked to the CLD director and their own principal, asking, what do you want us to learn? What do you want us to ask? And they eventually came up with these questions. What kinds of unique secondary biliteracy programs could BVSD create, that's the district, to best help emerging bilingual students across the district? And then they had sub-questions about the experiences of current high school students across the district, about the wishes and aspirations of middle and elementary school students and their parents across the district, and about the characteristics of strong bilingual programming at secondary level. And these are really great questions to be asking. The students generated them. So then they learned from history. A lot of the curriculum was spent thinking about Boulder as a context, about our Chicano history in that space. Denver was one of the first spaces to step up. There was a student walkouts in the 70s asking for equality in treatment and education. The Keys v. Denver case, 50 years old now, still maintains bilingual education in Denver coming out of that, those student walkouts in the 70s. Also the Boulder Seis, Los Seis de Boulder. There's a lot of history to learn, so they learned from history. They talked to scholars, to the CLD director and the principal. They talked to future bilingual teachers and fellow students. They read and researched the demographics of their region, the research behind program models and policy, and they learned about the court cases that govern these policies. That actually speaks to historicizing, which is important in any context, and it's the idea that we reach into the past to find the stories that haven't necessarily been told publicly, that aren't necessarily part of the big narrative that we all hear most of the time. Find those hidden narratives of struggle and to situate ourselves within that work. We can learn from the past to help us build the future, so community histories and community ways of knowing get centered when we historicize. And the kids really historicize, not just, as I was saying, in the Chicano civil rights movement, and in the court cases that had been active in our region and nationally, but also in their own schools. They learned from the CLD director when she presented at the Kokabe conference. They sat in the presentation to learn about the history of bilingual education in Boulder itself and in Colorado. And they learned from their own families. They went home and asked their parents about their own experiences coming to this region, engaging in the struggles to get their kids into programming that served their needs. At one point on a tour of the Boulder campus, when we were learning about Los Seis de Boulder, which was an event that happened in the 70s when 6 Chicano activists who were CU Boulder students were actually murdered in car bombings, and the whole history was silenced. It's just starting now to come back out again. They got a tour, they saw the monument, they learned about this history, and one student said, hey, what we're doing is continuing in that history. We're like, yes, exactly, that's why you historicize. So then the question for you all, which I'm skipping, is how does history matter in your context, right? What is the ways that you've historicized and that history has played into the projects and ideas that you've worked with to build critical consciousness in your spaces? And how do you leverage history in the work you do every day? Whether you are actually like a history teacher, ethnic studies teacher, or whatever you do. When you think about the past, how does that impact your now? There are ways in which history informs the kinds of questions we will ask in a research project, right? And that's what happened here. The students learned from their histories, and then they went out and it wasn't sequential. Actually, it was happening all at once because 9 weeks each group. They went out and they collected data. They interviewed fellow students at another district high school, a comprehensive high school that had a newcomer center and an ESL program that's well established. They asked the kids what they liked and what they wanted and what was missing and what was there, you know, and they got feedback from elementary and middle school students who were in dual language programs. What did they like about their programs? What did they hope to see in their future program in high school? They talked to pre-service bilingual teachers and teacher educators in Denver at the Metro State University, which is very different from CU Boulder. It actually serves it's a Latino serving institution, and it has a large bilingual pre-service teacher education program to prepare the teachers for dual language and bilingual programs, right? So they also got that CU Boulder campus tour, learned about history. They collected photos. They recorded observation notes, and they also recorded interviews. So they had all this data. In a way, at that point, they were critically listening to their communities. And critical listening is when we deliberately make space for the silenced voices. So if historicizing is pulling stories from the past, critical listening is looking into our communities and pulling the stories out that might all not automatically be heard. It's making space for voices that might be silenced to become vocal. And it's taking their messages seriously in the ways that they're conveyed, which is often bilingually or in languages other than English. So critical listening at the personal level, at the school level, at the community level are all crucial to critical consciousness. And our kids were basically serving our district by doing this, critically listening across the district to what we wanted. Critical listening is also the opposite. It's communicating about silenced ideas and silenced, breaking silences around sexism, racism, linguicism, colonialism. It's talking about these things and centering caring, reciprocity, and positionality in our work. That's all a part of critical listening. So critical listening for our kids, given the spectrum of biliteracy that they represented, bilingually was a super hard challenge. And it was a challenge for our workshop leaders, both of whom were bilingual in their own ways. All of us bilingual on different pathways and biliterate from different directions, right? But using Spanish in academic spaces proved really challenging. We found it especially challenging to keep up the Spanish, even though those students were very accustomed to being only in English in their academics. So even our Spanish dominant students who spoke Spanish beautifully had to make an extra effort to, and make themselves a bit uncomfortable to keep using their Spanish, even when they were in this English dominant space, right? We had one, just an example, an exit ticket one day at the end of the workshop asked them to make some compromisos para crear un espacio bilingüe, right? To make some compromises, some commitments to a bilingual space. And these were some of their responses, both written in Spanish and English. And in their Spanish, voy a expectar a hablar mayormente en español, aunque no sea natural en este espacio escolar. They talked about it, but it was uncomfortable. It took some work, and it wasn't always easy, and it didn't always succeed. That's how we engage with discomfort, though, and doing so allows us to learn and grow in new ways. So it's when we experience and learn from those unsettled feelings that come up, recognizing our privilege, reflecting on it, and pushing back against it, because entitlement or silence can reify and reproduce social injustice. So when we take ownership of those things and lean into that discomfort, then we are working towards justice. This is especially important for members of the dominant community, but in a sense, all of our kids' English was dominant, even for our Spanish-speaking students who were, in some ways Spanish dominant, but in that academic space, English was hegemonic. English was powerful there. So we were pushing back against that, making Spanish matter in our School of Ed building and in their academic building. And when we resist feelings of discomfort, it can lead to backlash. Here are some recent examples from our larger society, right? Backlash against discomfort by the dominant community can lead to oppression, can lead to censorship, it can lead to curriculum bans, and to basically discomfort, unless it's engaged with, can lead to oppression. People will push back against the discomfort, and that can lead to oppression. As white people, we have to live with knowing we have unearned privilege and moving forward with that. Educators, middle-class people have to learn to share power in our communities, in our schools. And school norms have to shift to allow for norms from culturally linguistically diverse backgrounds to be centered and engaged within the structures of the school. If we arrange to keep ourselves comfortable as educators, then somebody else is inevitably made to feel uncomfortable. But if we lean into the discomfort, then we're doing the work. We're working towards justice. So that's discomfort. Also, there was a bit of our project that made the adults uncomfortable. We spoke to our school board. It was not easy to get our youth group on the agenda for our school board in the district. They were uncomfortable with having youth speak to them without first vetting them. The principal had his moments where he was uncomfortable with having the youth speak to his board without having vetted them necessarily. So we did vet them. I mean, we actually let them speak to the staff first. There was some discomfort. The adults are not used to listening to the youth. And youth had a lot to say, and it wasn't always what we wanted to hear. So that led to some discomfort too. This is actually a picture, though, of the students presenting in Philadelphia at the American Education Research Association. There were grants available for bringing youth groups to the education conference. So they did speak to the president of AERA. They spoke to other youth groups. They met scholars in education. There are ways in which YPAR is becoming a national movement to get youth voices right into the conversation. So critical listening and engaging with discomfort. What time? No, sorry. I won't have time, so you have to come to my workshop. But I do want to ask you to think about, when has critical listening been central to your project? And when have things become uncomfortable, and why? What made things uncomfortable? Because it happens, right? It's part of the work. What happened in our case? So reminding ourselves of the framework, the 4 things, 4 actions towards critical consciousness, and also the things that come out of it. We saw all these things come out of it. We saw translanguaging, as I've just demonstrated. That was the students' way of engaging their discomfort around being biliterate and bilingual and working towards centering Spanish in their work. We also saw affirming identities, and we saw acompañamiento. First of all, this acompañamiento and affirming identities, the students developed solidarity with history, with current activists, guest speakers, scholars. They were researchers too. They understood the importance of the work of the lawyers who fought the court cases in the past. They developed solidarity with other stakeholders throughout their district, other high school kids, the elementary school kids they interviewed, the parents they connected with. They also developed solidarity among their own community. They accompanied one another on the journey across language and literacy backgrounds. So within that development of community, they negotiated their own biliteracy identities as bilingual students and as researchers in different ways. Well, all of us did. I would say that's the same for me as well, and for our workshop leaders. Maya will be presenting at the American Association of Applied Linguistics conference coming up in March, because she as a TA was so impacted by this experience that she's going to present a poster about her journey. So acompañamiento was prominent. Negotiation of identities was important here. Also, the youth developed as language policy actors. They learned how to communicate their ideas, how to advocate for what they believed, how to communicate with different kinds of audiences and think about their audience. And they also learned that they kind of already were language policy actors, as all of us are in the spaces where we choose which language to use, and in spaces where we make decisions around what we spend our energies on. So they became empowered in both of those ways. They presented their findings at the Colorado Association of Bilingual Education, where they leveraged the opportunity, and this was their idea, to interview the teachers who came and gather more information statewide from teachers. They presented it, as I mentioned, in Philadelphia at the American Educational Research Association, and they presented to their district's school board, which was the hardest presentation of all. Of all of those audiences, their own school board became the more challenging one. CU also, my institution, the School of Education, just had a building dedication, and our students were invited to share a poster of their work, and this was the poster that they shared. Now they're writing up their findings in a policy brief and also in a research paper. The policy brief is nearly done. I wanted to potentially be able to share it. It is not done yet. They're working on it. The research articles for the spring. This is the group that went to AERA. On this poster here, they have a shortened version of their findings, which came out and were presented to the board. And so I'm going to give you an idea what they ended up finding, because I think it's valuable for all of us to think about. They had five recommendations. The first was improving support for, and remember, they were just asked to think about high school bilingual programs. That's what the district and their principal wanted them to do. They ended up going much beyond that. Their first recommendation is improving support for multilingual students in all spaces at all high schools, and they had specific recommendations for how. They also wanted to see more bilingual staff and more course offerings at all BVSD high schools. And they were continuing with their strategy of finding ways to convince the district that this is doable, right? Priority hiring of bilingual folks for when spaces open up. Also bringing in more teachers who speak Spanish from different spaces in the world, and encouraging teachers who are already bilinguals to teach new content in Spanish in their high schools and preparing them to do so. So they had ideas. Their third was district-wide initiatives to support bilingual and multilingualism. It was interesting. They did vet their ideas with the CLD director, their director of bilingual ed, and she gave them lots of feedback about the ways in which she's already doing a lot of those things, which I thought was intriguing. She felt it seemed defensive almost, that the students would come up with things that she was already working on, which of course she was working on, that's her job, and she was doing a very good job. She is doing a very good job, but there are spaces in which the students didn't know about it, and that is an issue. right? So she gave them feedback, so they built that in. So instead of do this, the students couched it as continue to do this. Or instead of creating a district-wide celebration, they changed it to further advertisement of the district celebration, right? That would potentially appeal to young people instead of just potentially the families that have been coming. So they worked together with the CLD director to support her to feel okay with their findings. Their next one was a high school dual language strand. Now, one concern among the adults was that these kids were going to advocate to have that at their high school. They did not. They said, our high school is too small for that. We shouldn't have it. It should be at the school that has the most kids who will be served by it. And so they had ideas about that. Then they had a recommendation about their own high school. These are the things we can do here. Very realistic, much more realistic than their adults were concerned they'd come up with. Kids can do this work. And when they do, they come out empowered and engaged in their community and their civic worlds. And they inform us, because their voices actually matter. They're the ones we're serving. They're the kids. Their futures are the ones that are at stake, right? There are no bridges. You build those bridges by walking. And kids themselves can help us bridge them. All right, so I've got a few resources to share, and the QR code for the slides is coming up, so you don't have to take photos or anything. These are some books and also websites and links that have resources for doing YPAR in communities in different spaces. Here's a resource for support. It's a practitioner-oriented resource, so it's meant for teachers and leaders to think about the gentrification of bilingual ed, to think about how to counter that and make sure that our bilingual services, our ELD programs, our multilingual educational spaces are serving bilingual kids and not just English-dominant kids. We have my book again, because I'm plugging my book, because, you know, you have to listen to me, so. But no, it's a practitioner-oriented book, too. It's short case studies, which can be useful with groups of teachers or groups of parents, if English speaking, because it's only in English right now, we're working on that. And it's case studies of different spaces across the country. I don't remember if there's any Minnesota cases, but there are Midwestern cases for sure of different kinds of dual language bilingual programs working towards critical consciousness using the actions. And it's illustrating the actions, so it's a good way to teach those. There are some more books that can support work in, some of these might be familiar because I wouldn't be surprised if Susana mentioned En Comunidad and Rooted in Strength. Those are her colleagues who she worked with at CUNY. And these are books that are supporting practice that works towards critical consciousness in different kinds of ways. I use the Rethinking Bilingual Education book in my classes a lot. It's short articles that are also really helpful to stimulate conversation about justice in language education spaces. I don't know if anybody has seen Mike Mena's YouTube channel, but I recommend it. He makes academic concepts accessible, and he's quite a character. So that's some resources. This is the actual plug for my workshop. If you want to talk more about some of these ideas, try out some of the tools that we use with the kids, come to my workshop, which will, I think it's here. I get this room. I'll be right here at 12:45. And I put this in before I realized that UW Minnesota actually have a similar program called Project Momentum, right? But this was a certificate, an online certificate program we have at my institution that is part of a stacked certificate master's program. It's almost entirely asynchronous. There's a synchronous online component in the summer. It's a 10 credit hour certificate for cultural linguistic diversity in education, and it's embedded with some of the concepts that I've just been presenting. There's also other certificates, so you can stack them to create a master's degree from CU Boulder in ways that might support your needs. But Project Momentum has online and a growing number of online opportunities for all of you too to do professional development in ESL and classroom methods and ideas that will support your work. They have a table outside. Okay, so there's the references from today, and basically that's it. Thank you. And that's it. The time.
Thank you, everybody. Go off. We have a wonderful selection of workshops, so thanks for being here today. And again, if you want to talk more about how to do this research with youth, come back at the 12:15 workshop. Was it 12:15? 12:45? Something like that. 12:45. 12:45. All right. Thank you.